Welcome to the How Soccer Explains Leadership podcast, where we explore leadership principles through the lens of the beautiful game.
Welcome back to How Soccer Explains Leadership. Thanks again for being a part of this conversation. I'm Phil Dark, your host, and with me is my brother, my co-host, Paul Jobson. Paul, how you doing, man?
Phil, we're doing well, man. We are wrapping up the end of the school year and all the craziness that goes along with that, as you know, and getting ready for summer camps and vacations. And so we are speeding up to speed up again. So it's all good, man. But how are things with you? How's the family? Are you guys kind of in the same mode right now, or what?
We are. In fact, school ends tomorrow, so that's when we're recording this. When we will release, it'll be out for, probably a few weeks. But, it's crazy. We got a wedding coming up in a few months, so that's taking a lot of the time. We got a few other weddings before that. We got family camp. We got all kinds of cool stuff. But I actually just got back from doing a pretty amazing thing where we made some videos for the global sport movement that will be training people in disciple making and other things using sport, play, fitness. And the coolest thing about it is those videos are going to be translated into 21 different languages. So the reach will be like 5.1 billion people. So we recorded them in English. And so I will be on that screen speaking 21 different languages, and my lips will be moving as if I'm speaking that language fluently. So it's pretty amazing. I've seen the one in Portuguese, and it's kind of creepy, actually, a little bit. At the same time,
you're
pretty
just
amazing.
more amazing every day. You know that?
Well,
you're just more amazing every day.
I wasn't gonna say it, but that's what Becca says all the time. As I'm sure you can imagine. So it just is what it is. So I just gotta work with it. But so it was really cool. Got to do that out in Orlando, and then went to the Coaches on Mission gathering, and that was great. You'll hear some of the people that I was able to meet. We'll get on the show here in the future. So that was out in Charlotte at the Charlotte Eagles facility. It was actually not at their facility, but down the street from their facility out there in Matthews, North Carolina. So yeah, it's been a great couple weeks, the last few weeks. But I'm sure everyone's wondering, is it starting to warm up in Waco?
Oh man, it is actually really hot. We've hit 100 degrees this week already. So
wow.
1 week of spring was over and summer is upon us, my friend.
Okay. All right. I'm sure people were just wondering if we were going to get to the Waco weather report. So
we find a way to squeeze it in.
Yes. So, okay, good. Using the pool already, I assume.
Of course, man.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good.
Well, I know people want to hear more about that, but we probably should move on.
We do. We are going to move on. We are. I was just getting there. We got another Paul. We got Paul Gizzi. Paul is a friend. He is a man. Speaking of the Charlotte Eagles, he's been part of Missionary Athletes International for a long time with the Orange County Seahorses, SoCal Seahorses, now SoCal Eagles, and so much more than that, which we're going to get into. Paul, how you doing?
Doing well. It's good to hear you guys. Glad we're not 100 degrees here.
Yeah, no, yeah, very, very grateful it's not 100 degrees yet up here in North Cal either, but you're down there in Los Angeles / Orange County with the SoCal Eagles. And like I said, so much more. We always love to just hear stories of our guests. And, you got quite a story. So can you share that? Just kind of briefly share how you developed your passion for soccer, coaching, ministry, leadership, and how you did end up working with the Seahorses, now Eagles, for the last 22 years or so. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's actually been 32 years.
32 years. That's what I meant. 32. Yeah.
Yep. I accidentally fell into the sport, to be honest with you. Back in the day when soccer wasn't that popular in the U.S., basketball was my first love. I got out of high school thinking I was all that, and arrived at Biola University thinking that was going to be my sport, only to find out that most of the guys trying out for basketball were taller and quicker, and I was out there goofing around catching some balls one afternoon on the soccer field, and the coach saw me and says, "Well, you got good hands. Why don't you be a goalie? We need a goalie." And I started for my freshman team that year. They had a freshman, JV, and a varsity team. I couldn't make the field as a field player on any of those three teams, but I got to start goalie for the freshman team. So it's all in God's providence, isn't it? So the story goes from there, but I don't know how much you want me to continue going here.
Just kind of share how you ended up, kind of take us up to how you started with the Seahorses ministry.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, this is for me, this is part of God's providence too. I did get to play my sophomore year. It's called this thing called academic probation. And as I sat and watched all my teammates and colleagues play my second year, I did play a little tennis that year instead, but came back, played my JV year, and was a backup for the varsity, the ex-tough Marine guy. And man, I'll never forget at the end of that season, walking into the hallway before the locker room and hearing the guys say, "What are we going to do next year for a goalkeeper? All we have is Gizzi." Ouch, that one really hurts, right? So I went out, got on the worst team I could find that summer, went and got a couple buddies to just dribble at me, take the ball off their feet, had them shoot at me, just learn how to dive. Came back that first junior year, and the guys were going, "What in the world have you done, Gizzy?" And I says, I worked. And, that speaks to the work ethic, by the way. But we ended up going 11-4-1 that next year, or 11-4-2, and missed going to nationals by 1 goal. And it was a heartbreak year, but went back and played the next year as a varsity keeper. I ended up getting drafted at the end of that season by the Seattle Sounders. And I had no idea there was such a thing as professional soccer, but ended up going up and playing for the Sounders for the next 2 years. And then in the offseason got traded. And I got traded to a team called the LA Aztecs, came down, thought I was going to be all that down here as well. I was so excited. My goal wasn't necessarily to play soccer. It was an egotistical, performance-oriented goal. I just wanted to be a pro soccer player, right? And was satisfied with the name pro being associated with my name. And God was going to go to work on me at that point. So bottom line, I'll never forget, I was in the Rose Bowl playing against Georgie Best, pretty famous old Englishman, a drunkard at that. But my buddies were watching me. I was just thinking something else about myself. The next day, probably the top American goalkeeper, Bobby Rigby from the Philadelphia Adams and New York Cosmos, shows up into practice. At that point, I knew there was trouble. I knew the old goalkeeper was still there. The new guy, I wasn't going to beat him out. I knew I was about to be cut, humiliated in front of my buddies. That night, I had a little pity party in my pillow for about 2 hours. Literally, I hate to admit it, but I was full of tear. And the Holy Spirit, I'm telling you, I've never felt such a warmth and a sense of arms surrounding me saying, "All right, Paul, are you done yet? Are you over yourself? Let's do this thing." And I said, "Lord, I will do anything you want, anywhere, anytime." I said, "I'll be happy. And if you ask me to clean toilet bowls, I'll do that and be happy." I should not have made that promise. The next day I go to practice, the coach calls me in and says, "Hey, Paul, we're trading you to San Jose. What do you think about the earthquakes?" And for me, that was just great, because now at least I'm not humiliated. I get to still play. Ended up in San Jose for the next 2 years. In the off seasons, my buddy put me to work in the oil fields, turning nuts and bolts on compressors and turbines and valves. And when he had to make layoffs, he said, "Paul," he said, "I can keep you on as a janitor guy." I said, "I'll take it." Guess what I started doing? Swishing toilet bowls in the off season. And 2 years later, I decided, you know what? That was the end of the soccer career. Me, along with 13 other players, got traded from the Quakes that year. And I said, this is not security. God's prepared me for something else. Let's get about it. And so when the high school, went to a small Christian high school that was just starting up, I said, "I'd love to work with you guys." They said, "We'd love to have you, but we have a part-time PE position." I said, "Well, if you want it full-time for me, I got a young kid on the way, and that's the way we got to go." Well, they hired me. They wanted me, and hired me on as their janitorial supervisor, which meant when the students aren't there, guess what you're doing? The Lord reminded me once again that I was not only a soccer player, but a toilet bowl swisher. So that's sort of how I got my start in the soccer game and became a coach there. So I'll take it from there. The Lord had to, A.W. Tozier says, God can't use a man till he's been wounded deeply. And that embarrassment and humiliation was a deep wound that I had to put aside my performance-oriented psyche and personality and move on towards playing for the audience at one, right? Still have to work on that, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. Now there's so much there, and we'll get to the seahorses part too. But I just wanted to pull out a couple things there. One is you didn't have this is not a recruiting episode, because how you ended up playing soccer at Biola is not the typical route. So we're just making sure we have that caveat for this episode. It's changed a little bit in the recruiting. So to play at Biola, don't just think, oh, I can go there and play basketball and then, go in Paul Gizzi's PE class, and then the coach will see me and I'll then be the goalkeeper. It's gotten a little different, but it still could happen. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying that's not the norm. The other thing I just want to pull the thread a little bit, is you talked about playing basketball. You talked about playing tennis. You know, can you just speak to that in a day and age now we have of specialization? Can you just speak to that value of playing multiple sports in your youth, what it did for you, what you think, why you think it's important for kids to be doing that?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I grew up in Japan, and I would come home from the U.S. military base school to a Japanese high school, and the Japanese kids would invite me over. I was taller than them. Hey, come
Mhm.
play basketball, Polo-san. And that's where I cut my teeth, playing basketball with older kids. My dad was a tennis player. He would play tennis with the U.S. Marines on the base. I would get leftover tennis with dad. Those were my two main sports. You get to Biola, and for me, all of a sudden, tennis was my extra sport. I played it for 2 years, but in life, soccer became work, and tennis became the joy, the pleasure. Now, believe me, don't call it a sport, but my wife and I play cornhole every other day, just about. She pulls me out there. Well, there's something about, understanding God's given gifting in your life and utilizing that. And so to me, I didn't grow up in the era a lot of you kids, probably even Phil, your kid did too, whereas you play in the club system, you work your way up through your life is owned. Even in college anymore, I consider college athletes professional athletes. Coaches own their time.
Mhm.
And the era and day in which you could play soccer in the fall and tennis in the spring is gone, uh, sadly. I think there's something to be said for being able to play multiple sports, and the advantage, not just in the sport itself, but in the friendships created through that. So yeah, because anyway, and the pressure, you spoke also to it. Uh, Soccer was just getting started in the U.S. back in my day. I was there for the right time. Anymore, if you haven't paid thousands of dollars and committed thousands of hours as a parent into your kid playing ball to get that scholarship, it's probably not happening. And so I love to speak to the whole thing of performance and ego and opportunity in young kids these days, and a sense of their self-worth. I always ask soccer players, who are you without the sport? And I think that's a question we all have to ask. But obviously, that's part of our psyche. That's part of our makeup too. So, yeah, I'm so thankful to have been able to play multiple sports. I think
Yeah,
it added
absolutely.
to who I am.
Yeah, and that question, we're gonna get into some of that stuff later on as well. But the last thing I just wanted to pull out of there too is you mentioned it there too, just as far as growing up in Japan. Were there things about growing up in Japan that you learned that obviously now having raised some kids here in the U.S. that you learned there that you might not have learned if you grew up here in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up, I'm going to say it, as a Caucasian minority, which is an interesting thing. I remember the Japanese, where we lived out in town, they hadn't seen too many Caucasians. They would come up and touch our hair, and you know we had actually learned how to speak the language, but there was something special about us. And so in a way that was a blessing. But I learned also there was often times when you felt very alone and very different or laughed at. And so there was a sense of growing up with this with a feeling of being different. So acceptance of others. I think that's one of the qualities that I learned. We were accepted but different. And so I have a heart that loves to reach out to those that are different And I think God was able to pull that together for me later in life. But yeah, I love the fact that I have two cultures and can appreciate other cultures, international. I've been able to travel through this game of soccer all over the world and appreciate what other cultures look like, the priorities they put on various things. And yet there's obviously it's very easy to point to the central creator God who created it all with such diversity and creativity. It's an amazing thing to be a part of all that and to recognize it.
Absolutely. All right. So the last thing, real quick, before we get to the next question with the other Paul, I'll say Jobson, Mr. Jobson, is so when we kind of left off with you cleaning toilets, you also had some other roles at that school, but you were all kinds of different things, principal, assistant principal, I think teacher, everything at that school, it seemed like. How did you end up then at the Seahorses?
All right, well, that's a good one. I knew in the third year of my principalship there at the school that God was speaking to my heart. I didn't actually understand what he was saying to me. I just felt that there was something different that was in the future. And as we began to pray, it was a very unique response to that prayer that God gave me. Uh, I had a little dream one night that the president of the Missionary Athletes International, Mr. Tim Conrad, was saying, if you don't use your gifts, you're going to wither. And I'll never forget waking up in a fright that night going, oh my word, I've been praying for God to do something. I had never had any sort of a dream where it was sort of like spiritual in nature, right? And so that was weird. But what really struck me as I lay there awake pondering that was the song came into my heart. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Oh my word, that was freaky for me because I realized I had been becoming comfortable with the things of life. We had just bought a house. A friend had given me a jacuzzi. Another buddy had given me his Honda Goldwing motorcycle. I had a pretty wife and 4 kids, and it doubled my wonderful Christian salary, to double, and was just making ends meet, becoming comfortable. And the Lord was prying me loose from that. And I was so taken by that song floating through my head. I said, oh my word, I wonder what verse, 1 says. I wonder what the verse is. So I got out of the bed, went up to the loft, pulled the hymnal out there, and started saying, all right, well, Lord, you got anything for me here? Verse 1 says, O soul, are you troubled and weary? There's a light for a look at the Savior and life more abundant and free. Oh my word, that's really what I was looking for. I was afraid to step into this, ministry experience because I was afraid of the lack of abundance. And yet the Lord talks about giving us that abundant life. And so I said, all right, I've got to look at verse 2 because I know there's a message in there that God's given me. It says, sin no more hath dominion over you. Through Christ, we are more than conquerors. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, there was that whole situation where I didn't feel adequate to represent God, to represent the Lord as a missionary. And yet it wasn't about my adequacy. It's about his adequacy and what he did on the cross for us. So I realized at that point I had no excuse not to say yes to the Lord. So now I really don't want to look at verse 3, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I look at verse 3 and it says, now go tell the salvation story to a world that is lost and dying. Oh, my word. Those were marching orders, my man. And I knew it. When the Lord speaks that directly to you about what he has for you in the future, you just say, Lord, I got on my knees and said, all right, let's do this. But I then began to fight the knowledge because I had been invited to come join Missionary Athletes International by the director 9 months prior. And I began to fight it once I knew what I was supposed to do. And I'll never forget being at church one Sunday morning with a friend, and the pastor said, if we were all on welfare in this church and tithed, we'd be in better shape as a church than we are. And we actually have millionaires in this church. And I turned to my wife and I did the gag me reflex. And I said, oh, my word, what a stupid thing to say to your millionaires or to your church with your millionaires there in the midst. And I'll never forget, the pastor then said, folks, our problem isn't money. Our problem is trust. We trust the Lord with the 10% tithe and offering. We write that little check, but we take care of the 90. He says, when we can trust the Lord for the 90 as well as the 10%, can you imagine the things we can get done for the Lord? I was under such conviction at that point that I've been fighting. I mean, I grew up as a missionary kid on the field, eating rice and pickles for 2 weeks. I didn't want to be a missionary and raise support, but I knew right then that I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to flourish, if I didn't want to wither, it was time to say, Lord, let's do this. That's when I said, all right, Tim Conrad, Seahorse Soccer, MAI, I'm ready. God's called me. And that was the journey 32 years ago that got started. No regrets, richest man in the world. Two kinds of people live alike, millionaires and missionaries. We're both rich. It's just a different type of richness.
Yeah, amen to that.
I love that. There's so much in your story, and I'm sure there's so many things we haven't probably even touched that I'm sure Phil is just chomping at the bit to maybe even dive more into. So, but before we jump into that, we've kind of gotten into it a little bit. I think we kind of hear the thread of it, but Paul, would love for you just to tell us, what's your personal why? What's your life purpose? How are you living that out?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. My personal why started back in high school as a basketball player when the coach walked out on us at the quarter. We were down 25-0 against an opponent that we probably had no business playing. I was on probation that day for working that week. I had a job, I had to make ends meet, so I wasn't being allowed to play. I told the boys, I said, all right, guys, since coach ain't here, I'm your coach. Let's do this. And I'll never forget, that was such an impactful moment in my sports life to have a coach walk out. So I decided at that point, someday I'm going to be a coach that loves on his kids, that they know that I'm all in there for them, and I'm going to know the sport. Those were my driving forces. That was my why. And so I ended up doing that, after I graduated from college. I coached for those 9 years before becoming the principal. And I want to make sure those kids, to this day, those kids and I are still connected in high school, many of them, and myself. I then, obviously, with the Seahorse Soccer Ministry, with MAI, I knew that, and I think Billy Graham said it so well, coaches impact more people in one season than a lot of folks do in a lifetime. And I began to realize that this is a dog that hunts, coaching. And so loving on the kids, being qualified, knowing the sport, and having them respect you provides opportunities to speak into their life. And so, yeah, coaching is certainly about the X's and O's and, practice strategy and all. But for me, it's about helping those young people walk a life that is worthy. And that's really my why. And maybe even going beyond just a coaching thing is to help coaches, coaching coaches. And I say that because I've seen too many coaches really wreck players. And their significance is found in the performance of their teams. And I'll never forget my first year coaching at Biola University. Women's soccer was a year where we were getting beat 8-0 by Azusa Pacific, 9-1 Westmont College, watching the coach hold up a double sign at halftime, code to his players to say, let's go to two-touch against these guys. Oh, yeah. And you know what? To this day, those girls knew that they were loved and that we would work on it. But yeah, those are things that were formative for me in the whole thing of why I do what I do, and that is to impact the persona, the whole person.
Yeah. First of all, I can't imagine a time when it'd be okay for a coach just to walk out on a team. I think I can say as a coach, there are probably been moments where I kind of wanted to get away and walk out in moments. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do here. But that would be wild. But I love what you're saying there. It probably a pretty consistent theme here on the show with coaches that we have on, that it rarely, when you talk to the coaches about why they do what they do, rarely, I might even say never, even I don't like to say never and always, but rarely is a coach ever about the X's and O's. It's about the relationships, at least the successful ones, the ones that I think in success is measured, I think, through those relationships, like you said. And I also think it's cool that God put on your heart that you need to know the sport. And in the moment you were coaching basketball, you didn't know that your sport was going to be a totally different sport one day.
Right.
But God prepared you to say, here are the things that I'm going to plant in your heart that you need to know. And then one day you're going to really understand what that means, because at the point you probably thought you knew basketball pretty well, right? You didn't know you're going to have to learn a
Correct.
whole new sport,
Right.
right? And become
Exactly.
not just a minister for the Lord, but a minister of sport also down
Correct.
the road. How is that? I guess really take us through MAI and Seahorses, which is now, I guess, the Eagles. How are you using your why? How are you using the tools that you've learned through that ministry over, I think you said 32 years with the Seahorses? How are we making disciples through that process?
Yeah, and let me, if I may, you just tripped another thought in my mind that I've
Yeah,
got to share.
please.
Coaches going to be listening to this. I absolutely recommend a book called Seasons of Life by Jeffrey Marks. One of the most significant, and I don't do a lot of reading, right? I'm just a jock. But that book says it all. That book was about Jim Erman, Baltimore Colts all-pro linebacker, and this little tallow boy, a ball boy in the locker room. It was, that was his idol, Jim Erman. And he became a sports writer. And when Jim Erman retired from ball, was coaching high school ball, he asked if he could follow him around one summer to see why he had such a successful program. And he said, it was amazing to him. He says, one of the women at the end of the summer said, "Hey, coach, what's our team looking like for the upcoming season?" Jim Erman responded to her and said, "Well, we'll know in 20 years. And she said, "No, coach, how are we looking for the season?" He says, "That's correct. We'll know how these boys are going to do in 20 years. I.e., he was speaking to the fact that what they were coaching was the whole person, and that they wouldn't know if it had sunk in to those young men they were coaching until 20 years down the road. And I think that's, goes along with that whole speaking of the why. I've really brought that into myself, is if we're not about investing into these young people's lives beyond the game itself, then we're not doing them justice, right? But, the why, how I lived it out. When God called me in the ministry, obviously on the front side, we had amateur teams. We were doing camps. Another piece of the puzzle was the international side of the ministry. And for me, that didn't start right out. Did a couple of trips to Mexico, and you see the poverty. You see a soccer ball made out of rags, or taped together being used. And you come from a country of much, right? We have so much, and so the ability to give to the sport, but that journey of going into coaching and impacting people, not just your teammates as a coach or the folks that you're coaching. I came in the MAI as a, quote, I'm going to call it a player coach. And, you sit yourself on the bench on occasion to make sure that those that have come out to impact others with you get to do the playing time. But, it's one of those things where you're strategizing. How can we use this game, rolling the ball out there, competing for 90 minutes, kicking each other's shins? How can you use this sport to impact an opponent after 90 minutes? Well, that's pretty tough. You can ask them afterwards when you greet them, bring them a soda, bring them a water, maybe bring them a piece of literature. "Hey, really enjoyed, that was a great goal you scored today," or, "Hey, did you like that stop I made on you, buddy?" There's different ways to engage, and yet say, "Hey, is there anything that," they know you're a Christian team from a Christian organization. You can just say, "Hey, is there anything I can pray for you today?" And we develop friendships through that mechanism. But really, it became more about the folks on your team investing in their lives and making sure that there was, we call it SMT, Sports Ministry Training. If practice were 2 hours, we'd spend the next maybe 30 to 45 minutes afterwards investing in the person, studying scripture, taking time to pray for each other, sharing each other's stories, just like we're sharing right now, getting to know each other and drawing strength from each other by doing that. But that's how the game, for me, for 32 years now, this side of it, the equation for me after 32 years, obviously, my role is we've got leaders God has put in place, exciting, new, young, energetic leaders. And my role is to get behind that whole situation and raise scholarship, raise funding, helping young people come on staff on the front side right out of college. These are exciting things to see God putting inspiration into other young people to become coaches, to see youth clubs start up where they've got the kind of coaches that I didn't have. Those are things that are a thrill to me.
Yeah. Are there, I think we have quite a few coaches that listen, I think, to this podcast. And I would like to think, just because of the nature of a lot of the guests that we had, there are probably quite a few Christian coaches. Some, they're coaching at all levels. They're coaching collegiately, they're coaching high school, they're coaching club. Some have the ability to share their faith in maybe on Christian campuses. Some don't because they're secular. Are there one or two things that maybe pieces of advice that you could give coaches that are Christian coaches that they might help them? One or two things that you've learned over the years that are maybe simple things that maybe we hadn't thought about that are maybe some guiding points to some of our younger or even veteran Christian coaches that are navigating how to be, ministers of faith through sport.
Yeah, I think one of the things as I look back at my years of coaching, I coming out of obviously 9 years of coaching at the high school level, and then another, I'm going to say it was 3 years of coaching at the collegiate level, and then another probably 30 years of coaching at the collegiate level through the Seahorse soccer ministry. But the one thing to me that stands out really is not so much the strategy, the coaching, the tactics and all, but it was the off the field time. In fact, at one point, there was a coach that was just tremendous with his X's and O's. I actually loved being in the environment. But what we realized as a mission is we needed more time off the field. And so that's what we went after. And I think, and that's tough when you're a young coach and you've got a wife and children of your own. You want to invest there. And that's a real fine balancing act. But you've also got these young people God has entrusted into your care to feed into their lives. And it's the off the field times that you can create into lifetime memories. Those are, to me, some of the things that happen, that you could make happen, but it's got to be intentional. There's got to be an intentionality into creating times, whether it's in your home. And hey, guys, we're going to meet at the home. We're going to have some cornhole, ping pong, darts. We're going to swim in the pool. We're going to do a barbecue. And then we're going to just spend a little bit of time telling each other stories. That is some of the most valuable time. I took a trip, and for 28 years, I've taken typically one trip a year, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to foreign countries. For me, it's been mostly Japan through the years, though there's been some Europe and other countries, Mexico. But one of the things that happens on these trips is for the guys to tell their stories. Who are you? What drives you? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And when you share those things with each other, it's really amazing what comes out. But I'll never forget the one story. I took these guys to Japan, these college guys from all over the U.S. And Campus Crusade missionary got together and said, "Hey, Paul," he says, we're going to do prayer, but before this morning in this schedule, but what's your schedule look like? I said, well, I got the guys getting together at 9:30. No, I'm sorry, 10:30 to meet. He says, well, you can't do that. He says, we got prayer. I said, well, no, you have prayer at 9 o'clock. I saw that. He says, well, no, we have prayer from 9 to 12. And I said, I swallowed my surprise and was kind of, 3 hours ago, what are we going to do with 3 hours of prayer? Holy moly. And I'll never forget at the end of that trip, the guys all on their surveys commented on that being one of the most powerful things they'd experienced with the various styles. It wasn't just prayer, it was sharing prayer requests, praying for each other personally, praying for each other corporately, praying for our opponents, different styles of prayer. But that was, it surprised me. And here I am, a missionary at the time. And yet, so those are the kind of things, spending time off the field, doing unique things. Now, I don't recommend 3 hours of prayer when you only have 3 hours of practice, but I'm just saying that was over a 2-week period, that particular 3 hours impacted those guys for a lifetime.
Yeah, I think you've hit it spot on. I love you sharing that. I appreciate it. I think that the word intentionality, really comes through. And I think over our career, the teams that probably were the most successful were the ones we really were the most intentional with off the field. And
Yeah.
you saying that just kind of reminds me of like, okay, what were the things that we were doing? Not just you can't neglect the on the field stuff because you have to hone your
Yeah.
craft, but there is something to that team atmosphere. And then if you're ministering and you're discipling, there is that off the field intentionality. And I know even my college coach was so great about having us to his house. And those are some of me and my teammates' greatest memories were the ice cream parties the night before games, which I never would have done that with my teams, to give them ice cream the night before game, but it worked out for us. But
Yeah.
Phil, what are your thoughts on some of that?
I love it. I love it. I think, like you said, intentionality is key. And I think there's not one way to do it. I think a lot of it starts with us being able to make sure, and that's why prayer was so powerful, is because we need to be, you know, walking with the Lord. We need to be communing with the Lord as the coach. And if we're doing that, then I think the rest follows, right? I think because we can't give out what we don't have. Right? As they say, like when you squeeze the orange, what comes out? Right. And so if we aren't building into who we are, it won't come out. And then that intentionality, and I think we are building in, then it will come out because it's just who we are, because when we are offering our bodies as living sacrifices, then we will be renewed. We will be transformed, and then our mind will be renewed. And then out of that will come the things that we can do. But I think, there are a lot of people that want to know that next thing to do, that silver bullet that's going to be the great way to incorporate faith into coaching and everything. And I think there's lots of ways you can do it. But I think the key is, like you said, intentionality, to be able to make sure that you see it as a priority. And that's why that prayer story is so good, because if you look in that, we can't pray for 3 hours. There's no way. We got too many important things to do. Right. I mean, and we've all said that in different ways in our life. I mean, I'm going to actually, I don't want to speak for you guys. I've said that, not necessarily those exact words, but, I've said, no, I got too many things to do. I can't, go to that prayer meeting for that long. It's just too long, and, or I just don't want to, quite frankly. But that's where I think it's so key to be. But the prayer does so many things in us, that I think we neglect, and we don't really give it credit for. So there's so much there. I mean, we can go on and on. I mean, I could, as we know, there's many sermons that could be preached on that, what you just said, and so totally agree with that. Do you have
So
anything else to add
Phil,
to that? Yeah, go for it.
Phil, you just reminded me. So when you said about squeezing the orange, I use this analogy, a real one. I take well, the Japanese call it a pet bottle, a water bottle, and those squishy kind, and 16 ounces. And when I'm speaking to a group of athletes, maybe they haven't seen me for the first time, it's a little bit of a shock value. I say, folks, or this is coaches, if I'm talking to coaches, and they're out there in their t-shirts on the soccer field. So you got to make sure your cup is full. If your cup isn't full and you don't have enough to splash over other people, there's nothing. If it's half empty, it ain't going to splash. And then I take that water bottle and I squish it. And I just spray everybody with a little water to help see that visual of, you got to make sure your cup is full. You got to have enough to splash on people. When they're around you, you want to be giving them joy. And you want them, when they're out of your presence, you want them being reminded that the Holy Spirit in you spills over.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
yeah.
And you can't give joy if you don't have joy. That's for sure. So, no, appreciate that. And so I want to move in. That's a good segue into this book that you have written. I'm putting it up now. It's for those watching YouTube, you can see it, but if you're not, it's called God's Fingerprints in Coincidence. And Paul, you wrote this. I guess it says 2020 right on the cover, so I'm assuming that's when it was that's when it was written. There's a lot of really just cool stories in this. There's actually a cool little picture book in the back of Paul's life, which is really cool. And there's so much to it, but I just want to pick out a few, or really a couple stories. I know you said you have a couple stories you want to share as well, but just to get a kind of a glimpse into this. And first of all, where can people find this? Is it something that they got to find you and you got to give it out, or can people get this somewhere?
Right now, it is not on Amazon.
Okay,
I have copies here. I've done a reprint on it. It was originally written for my grandkids.
right.
I wanted them to understand the legacy that God loves to invest in us and does so in such deep personal ways that, things that happen that make you say, holy moly, you got to be kidding me. What are the chances of that having happened? And we all have these things that happen in our life. And my premise is that God orchestrates these things for one of two reasons. Number one, He's got a purpose in doing that for you. Or number two, as any good father, he loves to delight his children. So I wrote it intentionally. Well, when people started hearing what I was doing, they go, well, I'd like to see a copy of that. Well, to give you a little background on it, and I can tell you some stories from it, I'm not a writer. I don't even like to read, to be honest with you. Like I said, just an old jock. But I realized that I did want to leave a legacy with my grandkids. That was significant. So when I turned 60, somebody gave me a leather-bound journal, another seahorse player, and I kind of smiled and looked at God and said, "Right, you trying to give me a reminder that I should be writing?" So I wrote in the front of that to my wife, to my kids, to my grandkids, blah, blah, blah. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm going to do it. And then I went to the back of the book and I wrote 1980. This is what happened, 1983. And I put little stories that I would write about someday if I ever got around to it, right? Mr. Procrastination himself here. COVID came. And right before COVID, actually, hopped on an airplane to Japan, took that leather-bound journal with me. He said, Gizzi, you're not getting any younger. You probably ought to start writing if you're serious about it. As I'm on the airplane, the cabin attendant, a white guy, was speaking Japanese, unlike I'd ever heard another white guy. So in Japanese to him, I said, why do you speak such good Japanese? He said to me, why do you? And I said, I grew up in Japan. He said, so did I. He says, where? Southern Japan? Me too. He says, are you an MK? Missionary kid. I go, yeah. He says, you're kidding. What's your name? Paul Gizzi. No. He says, my parents worked with your parents and this other family. I go, the other family? I said, I'm going to have lunch with the other family. Well, what you have to understand is that coincidence happened right when I had finished writing after 2 years of procrastination and an hour and a half of writing my bio because I figured my grandkids needed to understand why I was writing. And I had just written the words, and now I'm going to write the first God incidents. And then that one happened. It was so blew my mind. For 6.5 hours, I couldn't stop writing. It went all the way to, 1980. I'm in Israel on the streets of the Via Dolorosa where Christ had carried the cross. And we're out with a soccer trip and we're all bartering for the same item, trying to compete to see who could get it for the best price. Somebody steps out and hears, hey, Gizzi, how much you getting it for? And somebody heard him say Gizzi. He says, you guys have a Gizzi on your team? Yeah, he's down there. Well, it happened to be my sister's boyfriend from back in junior high school in Japan. Here it is, 25, 30 years later, and just happens to hear the name on a street in Israel at that time on that day. What are the chances? What's the purpose? Those are the kind of things, right, that make you say, that got me going writing. Now, a lot of them have more deep purpose than that. That was one of the ones where God just delighted us.
Yeah, it's so cool. And there's so many of those, I tell stories of that, with people. And I encourage people out there, like, write these things down and remember them. Tell the story, tell it to other people because,
Yep.
I remember being in an airport in Newark, New Jersey, and there was a guy just says, hey, can I share this table with you at Starbucks? And he didn't sit down. And I thought, what's this joker doing? It's like 5:30 in the morning after a red eye. I was tired. And I look up and it's one of my friends I played high school soccer with. And I had just taken on the position with Providence World, and I was starting a new, kind of starting this nonprofit world. And it just turned out, coincidentally, right, that his job was helping nonprofits and for-profits visioneer, basically create the vision for their organization.
Wow.
And we sat down. We happened to have the same 4-hour layover in Newark, New Jersey. We're California kids.
Oh.
And I was actually supposed to meet with his brother the day before. I wasn't able to meet with his brother. And then I see him the next morning, and we met for 4 hours. And I took out of that, he goes, tell me your vision. I shared the vision. And he says, doesn't sound like your vision. It sounds like someone else's vision. He was right. It was the founder's vision. And so that conversation I go back to, it's actually, we had him on this show, Eric Pfeiffer, back in the day. Go listen to that episode. It's a great episode. But such a fun story. But like those stories, they're God just giving us little, taste of, this is what I'm doing. I'm giving you just a little taste. And on that note, I wanted to share that story, of that, where, you were, it's called the prayer for fruit, right? And, talking about that. Sometimes God gives us just little glimpses into what he's doing, I think, right when we need it. So can you just kind of share that story?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm so glad you shared what you just did, because that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to encourage people to recognize he does this, and it reminds others when they hear of mine of theirs.
Yes.
And it reminds us to turn towards the Lord. I was ready to move on after 15 years of this ministry. I was thinking I had been offered a position coaching college soccer, and I was just thinking, 15 years in high school education, 15 years in soccer ministry. Now let's just wrap it all up in 15 years of college coaching and impacting people, and then retire. Well, that wasn't to be the case. The fruit story, I'd taken this team to Japan that year, and I just said, Lord, this is my last year. I want to make sure that I need to see fruit, because it's tough work. The Japanese obviously are Buddhist and Shinto by religion. Less than 1% of the Japanese are Christian. And I just didn't feel like we were making the headway I had hoped to see. So we get there, and this young lady on our team, I get there, and the first thing I'm reminded of, I'm in a church, is this couple walks up and says, Paul, do you remember us? I go, no, I'm sorry, I don't. He said, well, we became believers back in 1996. It was on our very first trip to Japan that I took. And I said, wow, all of a sudden it reminded me that I'd been praying that God would show me fruit, to know that I should continue. And there was fruit I didn't even know about. And I go, wow, Lord. So I tucked that one in the back of my mind. The next location we move on to, a young lady who had also become a believer in our early years of ministry, was given her testimony in front of her non-believing Buddhist parents. And I was reminded, here is discipled fruit that I was reminded it exists because of our ministry. We go to the last location, actually a U.S. military base, a Marine Corps base, and a young 11-year-old boy had come to a place of belief, became a Christ follower as an 11-year-old Damien. And all of a sudden I'm reminded, here I've been praying for fruit, and here's a kid that just becomes a believer in front of my eyes. And so it's new fruit. So fruit I didn't know about, discipled fruit, new fruit. And I was going, okay, Lord, forgive me for questioning you. I will be faithful. I get back to the U.S., and 2 weeks later, I'm driving up as the assistant coach to a practice, and these two girls from the team could not wait for me to get down to the field, but they come running up the ramp saying, Coach, you're not going to believe this. We went to a Japanese church in Anaheim by Disneyland, and the people there asked us, what are we doing there? And they said, well, we went to Japan, and we've been given permission by a professor to write a project about, Japan, and we wanted to come to your church. And the guy said, oh, who did you go to Japan with, and why'd you go? Oh, we went with the Seahorse soccer group. Oh, do you know Paul Gizzi? Yeah, that's who took us. He says, I need to meet him. He, turns out, comes to our Seahorse office. He was a pastor there at the church and had come to faith in our very second soccer trip. to Japan all the years ago, and now as a pastor here in the U.S.
Wow.
I'm just sitting here going, when
Hmm.
I heard that story, it blew my mind that the Lord not only satisfied the prayer of my, heart and answered my question, but he went over and above, right, to show me that there was plenty of fruit. My role and my job is to just be faithful and trust the results to the Lord, not to get it done. That was a huge dynamic changing point. Obviously, now as I look back, I'm so thankful I didn't take that college coaching job. I have the richest life in the world. The fruit doesn't matter. There's lots of fruit. Obviously, the Lord showed me fruit because he knew in my weakness I needed to see some. But we as coaches have fruit, and sometimes we won't see it for 20 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and there's so much, I love that story because I've experienced that so much where I'm frustrated, I'm discouraged, I'm just like, what am I even doing here? And then,
Yeah.
when anybody that does anything for a long time, I'd imagine, and especially in the ministry, like you don't see a lot of the fruit. Most of
Yeah.
them, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, actually, like a
Mhm.
lot of what we do, we never see the fruit and we might never see it, but God gives us, I think he gives us those glimpses just enough to
Yeah.
say, hey, you're doing this stuff. You don't need to see everything. You won't see everything, but here's just a taste. Here's just a taste of what I'm doing through you, and it's really cool. Okay, so to flip it real quick, and then we'll kind of get into our last few questions. But there's this quote that you share here. It's by Fred W. Wevadow.
Yeah.
This is a different story. It says, when you share your strengths and victories, you become competitors in the game of life. But when you share your failures, mistakes, and weaknesses, you get onto the road of becoming brothers and sisters in Christ. I love that
Mhm.
quote. It
Hmm.
comes with a story that was a little different story of you playing tennis and, getting a little angry. And I just thought maybe if you want to share that, it's in your book. So I don't know. It's a fun little story, but it will share your weaknesses and failures, and then we can be on the road of being brothers in Christ. So I don't know if you'd want to do that real quick. So if not, we can move on. It's up to you.
I am glad to share. I have to laugh at myself these days. I can't believe you picked that one out. Oh, you're in trouble, brother, but I'm going to share it because it is in the book. It's funny as coaches, what drives is what a competitive spirit, right?
Yep.
So, uh, all these years, and by the way, that story, the people that I love to hang out the most with are the authentic, vulnerable people who admit what their weaknesses are. Too often I see people who just put on a show and it's facade. And you know what? You can't go deep there. So I love to go deep with people that are willing to just say, hey, I'm struggling with this. I need some help. In fact, when we're coaching and we take a trip, I love for the guys, maybe even prompt the guy on the front side to say, you know what? Help us get open, help us get authentic because man, it makes the trip a whole lot better. I was, this must have been 15, 16 years ago. And I was playing the men's tennis coach at the university. He was my singles buddy. And in the early days, I couldn't beat him. But he invested enough in me as an adult tennis player, trying to improve my game to where I started to beat him on occasion. But one day, my wife was watching. And I had a lot of stuff behind the scenes that I wasn't aware that was gurgling down in there, stuff with children that was really bothering me. And as I got frustrated, I knew that if you throw your tennis racket at the fence, you can catch it as it bounces off the fence. And that's how some people will smash a racket. There's other ways to take out your anger when you're playing. Tennis is a frustrating sport, probably like golf is to many. But as I went to throw it at the fence, it slipped out of my hand, flew over the fence and onto the pool deck in the community pool there. No one was in the pool, by the way. And as I walked the walk of shame to go get my tennis racket, I realized it was in the middle of the pool. I had to take my tennis shoes and socks off, my shirt off, and wade into the pool to go pick up my racket that I had thrown out of frustration at myself, nothing else. and come back in. And, you know, my wife and this tennis coach could not look at me in the eyes. They were just looking down until I came in. I started laughing. I go, guys, come on, man, laugh with me. And I was at that point cooled down, literally. But I use that story to this day with people to say, you know what, you never really get over the carnal nature that we have. I don't wear a halo. You know, I may be talking to you about sports and being responsible and representing Christ, but I'm still this person that makes mistakes, and I have to be careful of my ego. And so, yeah, that story is, oh my word. I hope that if there's any coaches watching this, they'll remember when they lost it at some point along the way, you know, and we look a little less polished than we might want to look, right? But hey, here's the way it is. God's not done with me yet. Philippians 1:6, being confident in this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will complete it until the day of Christ. God's still working on me.
Well, I know, I don't know as a coach if I've ever had a moment like that, or as a person. So I really can't relate at all to that story, Paul, but I appreciate you being vulnerable in that.
As
I
they
was
said,
gonna say,
Princess
Paul.
Bride, they said, liar.
Yeah.
Right.
And we, you know what, Coach Gizzi, we just learned that Coach Jobson, through, actually, I think it was the episode right before this one, we had a referee on who used to referee some of Paul's games. So we know that Coach Jobson wasn't the angel on the sideline that I had always understood he was. So I was shocked when I learned that he was really competitive in his coaching days. So.
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me about the only time I got thrown out of a game with a red card as a spectator. So,
Oh, well, you know, and
As a
you know,
spectator, wow.
yeah. Anyway, okay. Well, there it is. So
yeah.
we didn't, but you just brought it up. No, go ahead, Paul. Let's wrap this thing up.
Yep.
Yeah, no, Paul, love to hear, you know, a couple of questions we do with everybody, but one in particular, I'd love to hear from you. Your experience as a player. Was there a defining moment as a player that stands out to you to this day that really has kind of formed some of your leadership models and coaching models and maybe ministry models? Just as a player, is there anything that stands out to you that was a defining moment?
Wow. As a player, you
Yeah.
know, yeah, this is an interesting one. Probably the most defining moment for me. I was new to the Seattle Sounders. I was still in my own head, all excited. It was the very first game I got to suit up for. I had broken my wrist, by the way, had been in a cast for 12 weeks. I knew I wasn't going to get to play, but I was going to get to suit up against the very first game against Pele and New York Cosmos, Memorial Stadium up in Seattle. And here I am, all pride and ego. I wasn't going to get to play, but I get to go out onto the field and wave to the crowd on the left, wave to the crowd on the right, hear my name announced over the speaker, right? They get to everybody, and the last two guys, another starter who had been injured, both suited up for the day. All of a sudden we hear, and now, ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the singing of the national anthem? And we're looking at each other, and we realize they are not going to announce us. And my moment of glory was not going to happen. I have to tell you, that was a moment in which I watched his reaction out of anger. And I believe the Holy Spirit gave me a sense of, Paul, what's this about, you or me? And that's when I realized, okay, Lord, you give me the opportunity here to play ball. This needs to be about you, not me. I need to become lesser, and he needs to become more. And that's probably where I began to realize that the Lord had been giving me those 4 years of playing ball for a purpose much deeper than myself. And that's, to me, probably the most defining moment. Hey, yeah, can I remember when I saved the first 2 penalty kicks against Calvin College as a Biola goalkeeper and imagine being thrown up on the shoulders of my teammates? And then my teammates missed the next 3 goals and they made the next 3, and that didn't happen. Of course, you know, we can remember those kind of moments too, but the most impactful moment was realizing that God had a purpose in putting me where he did, and I needed to get my eyes off myself and put it on him.
Yeah, pretty consistent with, I think, a lot of our guests. That defining moment a lot of times isn't what people think, which is, it's not
Yeah,
always a glory moment. I mean, we learn a
yeah,
lot about ourselves in the moments that aren't, really glory moments. They're humbling
yeah,
moments. Those
correct.
truly are defining moments. So appreciate
Yeah.
you sharing that.
Yeah, I think we actually have had a couple that were glory moments that they realized were not as fulfilling as they'd hoped they'd be, right?
Hmm.
And you hear that a lot as well. So, all right, we have our last couple questions that we ask all of our guests, and the first one is, what is a lesson that you learned directly from the game of soccer that you have used in your marriage and parenting?
Hmm. This sounds kind of strange, but it can be a cruel game. It's not fair. You might dominate another team and still lose. And where I take that is that life isn't always fair. There are some things, some hurts and losses that you might experience. We live in a fallen world, and God's got a plan, and we can choose to trust that plan or to uh, be frustrated and angry about it. And if we harbor that frustration or that anger, and it leaks out, and you can choose basically to be an overcomer. And that to me is what harbors, for my life. I've chosen to be an overcomer. I've got two reverse shoulder joint replacements. I've got a left knee joint replacement. I've got titanium rods and screws in my back. I've got constant pain from neuropathy from botched surgery. Guess what? I'm trading this old carcass in, and I can't wait to get that new one someday. And by the way, you guys know how to get a smoking hot body at my age?
Oh, jeez.
Cremation. Oh, I threw that
Oh,
one in there for free, all right?
I knew
that's
that I
good.
knew that was coming because you told that to me last time I was at Biola with you at coffee. So, and I think the time
He'll be
before
here
that
all week,
even.
folks. He'll be here
It's,
all week.
it's the only one I knew. But speaking to
That's
the
not the
issue
only
of
one you got. Come on.
no, that's true. But
Uh,
it's the one that's reminding me at age 71 what I have to look forward to, right? Oh
Uh,
man.
you probably could sell like a 3 week course on that too, and just don't reveal the end of it till the final week of the course.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, you
Oh
could for
man.
sure.
So our last question, Paul, that we ask everybody, I think you may have already mentioned this one, but if there's another one, feel free to throw it out there. What have you watched, read, or listened to that's most impacted your thinking on how soccer explains life and leadership?
Yeah, I think it was Jeffrey Marks, Seasons of Life. I have to tell you that there was a couple other books along the way. Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald. That was a huge book. That was significant to me along the way. But when I realized that my life was about coaching and impacting others, that whole example of Jeffrey Marks, where he talks about what Jim Erman did and what their goal was in coaching, training these young men, investing in their lives. I had a young man who's now with the Lord. When I was straight out of playing ball, my very first teaching job, a young man named Scott Sims, we kept working over and over on upper V diving two-hand save. And in the highlight game at night against the rival school, he was able to pull that off. And what a moment to realize your coaching, your training, your faithfulness, something paid off. But you also realize this young man ended up passing from ALS
Hmm.
and years ago. We're supposed to go before our children, right? Or our athletes. But when they go, you begin to realize that I sunk my life into that guy. And it was just such a wonderful, beautiful relationship. To this day, I have a relationship with his former wife, with his daughter. And it's just rich when you invest in people's lives. And that's what that whole book by Jeffrey Marks is all about, investing in the lives of young people God has entrusted to you.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Well, thank you again, Paul, just for sharing this with us, for sharing this time with us, for just the life that you have lived, are living, and will continue to, no doubt. And so I'm just very grateful for our friendship. I'm grateful for this this conversation, and I just thank you, thank you.
Thank you, guys. It's always fun to relive this stuff and to realize one more opportunity to share how gracious God has been to me to use this unfit vessel to do his work. It's his adequacy, guys, right?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks.
Well, thank
And
you,
Paul,
everybody.
it's nice to meet the other Paul.
Yeah,
Yes, Paul. It's been great to meet you and learn more about you, and I appreciate you agreeing to come on here and share, not just with us, but with the many folks that listen to this podcast. So appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for engaging it as we get to have these great conversations. So we're just grateful that you are out there and using this stuff in your coaching, in your business, in your parenting, in your marriage, and everything that you're doing. And so if you want to learn more about Warrior Way, what Paul and Marcy are doing in Waco, you can check that out, warriorwaysoccer.com. If you want to learn more about coaching the bigger game, you can do that at coachingthebiggergame.com. We got all this in the show notes. There's several other things there in the show notes as well. But if you really like what you're hearing, subscribe to this show. You can then get every one of these episodes in your inbox, and it will be there ready for you to listen to so you don't miss anything. But as always, we hope that you are taking all that you're learning from this show and you are using it to be a better coach, to be a better parent, a better spouse, to be a better friend, a better leader, better in all that you do. And you continually remind yourself that soccer does explain life and leadership. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.